Okay, so a lot of people are still having trouble deciding which version of this formula for either Z or T to use. So hopefully this quick video will help kind of answer that question and give you the tools you need for deciding between these four versions that are all really similar of this equation. So the first thing that we want to decide is, are we doing a Z or a T test? All right, so we want to decide between kind of the left options and the right options, Z or T. So to answer this, you have to look at the standard deviation that's given. So you want to look at the standard deviation that's given in the problem. If the standard deviation in the problem that's given is talking about a whole population, in other words, it's the sigma for the population, then you're going to do a Z-score. If what you're given is the standard deviation of just a sample, in other words, if you have S, then you're going to do a T-score. So to answer this question, if you're doing Z or T, the first thing you want to look at is where's the standard deviation in the problem, and then sort of read it backwards to the beginning of the sentence to see, is it talking about a whole population or is it just talking about a sample, like 45 people or 25 people? And that's going to tell you whether you're going to do one of these ones on the left, a Z, or one of the ones on the right, a T. Okay, so that's sort of step one to determine Z or T. Step two over here, we want to determine, am I going to use the top version of the formula, which is kind of the more simple looking version, or am I going to use one of these two bottom versions that look more complicated? Right? So the key here is what we have sort of in this bottom area, right? What's here versus what's here, and what's here versus what's here. So the top version, we're just looking at plain old standard deviation. So in this case, the standard deviation of the population or the standard deviation that we get from a sample, but we're using to estimate for the population. In the bottom, this formula down here, the complicated looking one with the square roots, that stands for standard error. Okay? So I'm just going to kind of write a note here. It's not very dark. So this guy down here, that's really our standard error. So if we're talking about standard error, then we know we have to be talking about the SDOM, because the SDOM is the only thing that has a standard error. So this second question, am I doing kind of a top version or bottom version? This is where it matters which distribution you're comparing to. So this top distribution is going to be the population distribution. The bottom one is going to be our SDOM. And the real difference here, the key to help you figure it out, is the question asking about just one person, in which case you're going to compare them to the population, because the population distribution is made up of a bunch of individual people. If the question is asking about a whole sample of people, right? We've got a whole group of people, and we've got a mean for the sample. Then this is the case when we're going to compare it to the SDOM. So the two questions you really want to ask yourself are, one, what SD, what standard deviation is given? If the population standard deviation is given, or sigma, then you're going to do a Z. If the sample standard deviation is given, then you're going to do a T. The second question, which is completely separate from the first, this is where people have trouble, they kind of combine them. Whoops. So number two is, who are we asking about? if you're asking about an individual, then you compare to other individuals by comparing it to the population distribution. Okay, so this means divide by just the standard deviation. If it's asking about a whole sample or a group of people, then you're going to compare to the SDOM, the sampling distribution, and you want to divide that by the standard error. So these are the ways that are going to help you kind of narrow down to which of those 4 versions you want. Is it Z or T? That depends on what standard deviation is given. And are you doing the divide by standard deviation or divide by standard error? That depends on if the question is asking about just an individual person, or if it's asking about what's the probability of a whole sample of people. So hopefully this kind of clarified some things, and you can use this to help you out and guide you in which version of this formula you need to use in different situations.